Hello and welcome back to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. In this segment we're going to consider the doctrine of creation in two African religions, namely that of the Shona and the Akan. Textbooks tend to make the claim that all African religions acknowledge the Supreme Being as creator. So in this passage displayed on the screen it states that all Africans have always recognized a Supreme Being as creator of all things. And this can be seen in the way the Supreme Being is described as originator or creator of everything. Now that's fine as far as it goes, but it leaves us with one very big question unanswered. Namely, what does it mean to say that the Supreme Being is a creator? Does this mean a creator from nothing, or a creator from some pre-existing materials? This is the question we'll be asking in relation to the Shona and Akan peoples, the same ones we encountered back in week 1. Of course, neither the Shona nor the Akan have any sacred texts, so our information will have to come from different sources. And our sources will be the creation stories of these religions and the praise names of their supreme beings. In other words, the ceremonial names or titles of their god. Now, as we will remember from block 1, in the Shona religion the supreme being is called Moari. It is often claimed that Moari is the creator, but some of those who make this claim do not indicate whether Moari creates from nothing or from pre-existing materials. Yet there are other scholars who claim that Moari created out of nothing. For example, in his famous book called African Religions and Philosophy, John Mbiti wrote, or he tells us, that the Shona believe Moari created from nothing. And that seems pretty clear-cut. But I think we need to tread carefully here. For one thing, it's notable that Mbiti does not cite any sources to support the claim he makes about the Shona. In other words, he doesn't tell us where he got his information from. Now that might not be a problem if he was from the Shona peoples himself, as perhaps then he'd be in a good position to know about the Shona view of creation, since he would have grown up with it. But Mbiti was not from the Shona peoples. In fact, he was born and raised in Kenya, about 2,000 miles from Zimbabwe, where the Shona live. So how did he come by his information about the Shona belief in creation from nothing? He doesn't say, and that ought to make us a bit wary. You'll remember I said back in week 1 that it's often helpful to understand not just the words a person writes, but also who wrote them and why. And I think here is a good example of when it would be very useful to ask the who and why questions. First, the who. Who was Mbiti? Well, a quick Google search will tell you something very important about him, namely that he was raised as a Christian and that for a good part of his life he was an Anglican priest. A little more digging around, not just on Google but in his writings and those of his critics, will reveal that he studied African religions and philosophy from a Christian perspective, and also that he was convinced the Christian God of the Bible was exactly the same God as worshipped all across Africa in the various traditional religions. Because of this, Mbiti's critics said that while he thought he was just describing the notion of God that Africans believed in, he was in fact dressing this God in Western clothes. And so he ended up creating a notion of God that was unrecognizable to Africans who belonged to the traditional religions. And this is all important information. With all this in mind, if we look back at what Mbiti said about the Shona belief in creation from nothing, we should now be very, very wary of simply accepting what he says at face value. The obvious concern is that Mbiti may have consciously or unconsciously seen a Western idea, creation from nothing, in an African religion where it wasn't actually present. Of course, he may not have done anything of the sort, but the best way to find out is to look at other sources. Do they corroborate what Mbiti said about Shona belief in creation from nothing? Or do they point in a different direction? As it happens, we tend to find that other sources point in a different direction. For example, almost 100 years ago, Charles Bullock wrote in relation to the Shona god Mwari. He said, "The name Mwari conveys the idea of generation, not of creation from nothingness." Similarly, Muzikovanhu, another title of the deity, means a moulder of matter into men rather than a creator. We'll need to look at this passage in more detail, but before we do, let's ask our who and why questions. First of all, who was the author, Charles Bullock? Well, he was a white colonist. In fact, he was an officer in the colonial government in Zimbabwe, which was then called Rhodesia. And he was responsible for examining native customs. What else might be relevant? Well, he makes it clear throughout his book that he has a pretty low opinion of Shona beliefs and customs. In fact, he cannot even bring himself to describe Mwari, the supreme being in the Shona religion, as God. And what this tells us is that he certainly isn't going to want to overstate any similarities between his God, the Christian God, and Mwari. But we might wonder whether there's a risk of him wanting to overstate the differences between them, perhaps because he'll want to show the ways in which his understanding of God is superior to that of the Shona. Given this, should we be wary of what he says? Well, in this case, I don't think we need to be that wary, and I say this for two reasons. First, Bullock has at least tried to back up the claims he makes, which allows us to check to see how reasonable they are. And second of all, some contemporary Shona thinkers have said that his claims in this passage are correct. So whatever we might think of Bullock and his motives, we can place a good degree of confidence in what he says, at least in this particular passage. So let's go through the passage one sentence at a time. In the first sentence, Bullock says that Mwari, the Shona god, conveys the idea of generation rather than creation from nothing. Now, in the first block, we saw that some people claimed that the name Mwari means something like the one who is. Though, as I said then, that's very unlikely. The theory's been discredited. But other theories have been put forward for the origin of the name Mwari. For example, one theory says that Mwari derives from Muali, which is a term used in the Kilimanjaro region to denote God, the sower. So that's probably what Bullock is referring to when he talks about the name conveying the idea of generation. Moving on to the second sentence, Bullock points out that Mwari is also known by other titles, including Muzikovanhu, which he translates as moulder of matter into men. As it happens, the term Muzikovanhu is often translated into English as creator, but a better translation would actually be whisker or spinner or maker of people. It breaks down like this. The Shona verb kuzika means to whisk or spin or make. The prefix mu refers to the one doing it, and the noun suffix vanhu means people or humans without any reference whatsoever to gender. So putting all of that together, we get Muzikovanhu, whisker, spinner, maker of people, which is quite close to Bullock's statement that Muzikovanhu means a moulder of matter into men. Or at least it is if we suppose that by men he means people or human beings in general. And of course in English the word men was often used in that way, and sometimes it still is. So from the fact that Mwari is often called Muzikovanhu, we can determine that the Shona believe that Mwari made human beings in some way. Though obviously this doesn't tell us whether they believe Mwari also made the universe. As it happens, the Shona people have a variety of praise names for Mwari, another of which is Muziki. And this word is also often translated as creator, but is better translated as maker. So to the Shona people, Mwari is indeed the maker or perhaps creator, but note that there's no hint here of Mwari making the universe from nothing. This might lead us to suspect that Mwari is believed to have created the universe from some pre-existing materials. So let's just treat that as our working hypothesis for the moment. Is there any more evidence we can find to confirm our working hypothesis? Well, we probably can't get any further by analysing Mwari's praise name, so let's now put those aside and consider the Shona creation story instead. It's sometimes said that the Shona do not have a creation story explaining the origin of the cosmos. But this is not quite true, because there is the so-called Mwedzi story. And it starts like this. Mwari made Mwedzi at the bottom of a pool and gave him a medicine horn. In spite of Mwari's warning that he would be sorry for it, Mwedzi wanted to go on to the dry land, which was barren and lifeless. Now the story continues for quite a bit. It explains how Mwedzi produced trees, animals and people using his medicine horn. Now, like most creation stories, this one isn't intended as a literal account of what really happened, but rather a poetic way of capturing a set of deeper truths. In any case, if we read the story carefully, we can see that it appears to be less about the creation of the universe than about the creation of human beings and other creatures. Although it would be difficult to draw out any definitive conclusions about Mwari's creation activities from this story, the story does seem to suggest that the Shona do not believe that everything was created by Mwari. After all, the primordial pool appears not to be Mwari's handiwork, and perhaps not the earth either. And it is in fact quite remarkable that many creation stories tell of the world being created out of water. The Genesis story seems to say this, as does the ancient Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, and even the creation story of the Japanese religion Shinto, which tells of the universe emerging from an oily sea. Anyway, I think now we've got good enough grounds to say that in Shona belief, Mwari created from pre-existing materials rather than from nothing. Now before we finish this segment, let's see what is said about creation in the Akan religion of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. As we'll remember, the supreme being in the Akan religion is called Onyami. Now, one prominent Akan philosopher, Kwame Jeke, tells us that Onyami is known by many names, two of which explicitly refer to creative activity. So Borbo and Obawadi. The first name would seem to suggest a being that works with pre-existing materials, because you've got excavator, hewer, carver. They suggest pre-existing materials. But Jeke goes on to say that Onyami created out of nothing. But he doesn't explain why he says this. Now, a very different view has been put forward by Kwasi Werudu, who is himself an Akan philosopher. He argued that creation from nothing makes no sense to the Akan. So he says, to create is to bo, and the most self-explanatory word in Akan for the creator is Oboadi. Adi means thing and bo means to make, in the sense of to fashion out, which implies the use of raw materials. Any claim to bo and adi without the use of absolutely any raw material would sound decidedly self-contradictory in the language. Thus the Akan Supreme Being is a maker of things, but not out of nothing, so that if the word creator is used for him, it should be clearly understood that the concept of creation involved is fundamentally different from that involved in, say, Orthodox Christian talk of creation. The Akan creator is the architect of the world order, but not the ex nihilo inventor of its stuff. So according to Wiradu, Onyami does not create from nothing, but rather creates in the sense of arranging or ordering or fashioning what is already there, which would suggest working with pre-existing materials. So what are we to make of this? We've got one Akan philosopher saying one thing, which is that Onyami created from nothing, and we've got another Akan philosopher saying something completely different, which is that Onyami created from pre-existing materials. So which one of them is right? Well, strangely enough, probably both of them. To understand this, it's important to recognize that the Akan religion is not rigid and inflexible, like you might think some religions are. Over time, it has absorbed ideas from other religions, ideas that were not originally present in Akan belief. And creation from nothing is one such idea. On top of that, there is some variation in beliefs across the Akan population. The beliefs of the Akan who have encountered Christianity and Islam tend to differ from the beliefs of those who have not. So this is what seems to have happened. Before the Akan came into contact with Islam and Christianity, they didn't think of their god Onyami as creating from nothing. In fact, the Akan have no creation stories at all, as we would understand the term. The closest they have is a story about why Onyami went to live in the heavens, having initially lived on earth. So there's no reason to think that the Akan have traditionally thought of Onyami as a creator, at least in the sense of creating from nothing. However, from the 15th century onwards, the Akan have been in contact with Muslims and Christians, first because of trade and then later because of colonization. The belief in Onyami as a creator, and indeed a creator from nothing, seems to have emerged as a byproduct of the communication between the Akan and members of these other religions. But this was not the only idea that the Akan absorbed from the outside. Various other ideas, especially from Christianity, have been integrated into traditional Akan religion over the last 500 years, at least among those in the larger cities, where contact with Christians and Muslims was more common than in the more remote areas. So with all this in mind, it looks as though both Wirudu and Jeche are correct in what they say about Akan beliefs in creation, at least to a point. Wirudu says that the Akan do not think of Onyami as a creator from nothing. As a sweeping statement, this is surely wrong, because from the 15th century onwards, some Akan have believed that Onyami created from nothing. But the Akan did not believe this at all before the 15th century, and even today some of them still don't believe this, especially those that live in the more remote areas. So Wirudu is right, up to a point. As for Jeche, he says that the Akan do think of Onyami as a creator from nothing. Again, as a sweeping statement, it's almost certainly wrong, but we do know that since the 15th century, some Akan have thought of God in this way. So Jeche is right too, at least up to a point. So let's round up. In this segment, we've looked at the Shona and Akan beliefs on creation. We've seen that the Shona belief seems to be that the supreme being, Mwari, creates from pre-existing materials rather than from nothing. And we found something similar with the Akan religion, which traditionally has not thought of its supreme being, Onyami, as a creator from nothing. Although over the last 500 years, some Akan have believed this on account of Christian and Muslim ideas being absorbed into their religion. Now, it has taken quite a bit of work and analysis to reach these conclusions, just as it did when we looked at Judaism and Islam in the previous segment. Amongst other things, this shows us that it's not always easy to work out what a religion's doctrines are and why it has them. But hopefully this segment and the last one have also shown us that it's possible to make headway if we look hard enough at the evidence available and we ask the right questions.